Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. James Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, is well remembered for being the last president born in a log cabin and the second president to die by an assassin's bullet. Far less remembered is his record as a Civil War general. He served until 1862 when he was elected to Congress. Lincoln had a lot of generals. He needed some really skilled politicians and legislators, and Garfield fit the bill. So off he went to Washington, D.C. for the rest of the war. There's a photographer in Cleveland, Ohio, James Fitzallen Ryder, who knew Jim Garfield very well from back in the Buckeye State. And when Ryder came to write his memoirs of a half century as a photographer, he shared a few anecdotes about Garfield during his war years. And I want to share them with you because they're not quite as well known. And I think you'll find them interesting, students of the Civil War. So here's the first one. He says, Ryder, that is, says, quote, I remember well when Colonel Garfield, later general, a senator, president, and martyr, came to my gallery for a sitting. Though the bronzed complexion was the pallor of the invalid, that's his way of saying Garfield was on sick leave. Ryder continues, and though ill, his heart was strong, and the genial, cheerful air so characteristic of him was present. As I was sitting him, he remarked that he would about as soon stand before a gun, said it gave him the uncomfortable feeling of being aimed at to have a camera pointed toward him. Another passage I want to share is how beloved Garfield was. In fact, he was known as the common man's and the soldier's friend. And here's another passage from Ryder's memoir. He says, quote, I was much impressed with him. Garfield was truly the soldier and gentleman. His genial kindness was a distinguishing trait. It was my good fortune to see him often and know him through the rest of his life. The train master at the Union Depot in Cleveland told me how much he was beloved by the employees about the depot. He always had a kind word for everyone. When some subject was discussed that was beyond them, it was agreed to leave it to General Garfield. And when he came again, and there was a minute to spare, his opinion was sought and the question quickly decided. He was their authority and teacher in a hasty fashion. He was truly the common man's friend. It was told of him that once in Ithaca, New York, he was to deliver a lecture, and walking through the street with one of the most prominent citizens who was entertaining him at his home, he espied a man with overalls on and a paint pot in his hand who was evidently trying to pass unnoticed. The general excused himself from his escort a moment and made for the painter. Why, hello, Charlie, he cried. I am very glad to see you, shaking him by the hand meanwhile. As the painter passed on in happy confusion, Garfield turned to his escort and said, that is one of the bravest men I ever knew. He was in my regiment and one of my best fighters. Charlie was a recognized hero after that. One more passage for you relates to Garfield and his support of the Emancipation Proclamation, equality for men and women and children of color. And here's a story that relates to that, particularly about colored men and Garfield's presidential run. Ryder Notes, quote, the train carrying the colored delegation, I remember, was a merry one. The colored man loved the general. A band of music, all colored players, was a feature of the excursion. This excursion, by the way, was to Garfield's home in Ohio. Back in those days, presidential candidates weren't really into riding around and stumping. People came to the president. And so a group of Black men came to Garfield's residence to pay respects and hear Garfield and hear what he had to say. So Ryder continues. Quote, I rode in the car with the music and wondered whether the roof of the car of my eardrums would yield first. As the train reached Delegation Road, that was the road where the delegations drove up to greet Garfield. Ryder continues, as the train reached Delegation Road and was unloaded of its passengers, I noticed an aged colored man on crutches, so crippled from rheumatism that he walked with much difficulty. I noticed him again when, some 20 minutes after all the others had arrived, he came hobbling along, hurrying to hear the general's address of welcome. When the afternoon was in the wane and the delegation was preparing for its return to the train, I saw the old man starting ahead that he might reach the train by the time his crowd got there. I called the general's attention to the man who had performed that painful trip to see the man for whom he should cast his vote for president, and Garfield, without making any show of the act, hastily called a man from the stable, told him to hitch up his buggy as quickly as possible, overtake the old colored man, and drive him to the cars. And that was the Garfield of it. The poor old crippled man received that kindly attention gratefully. The incident did not appear in the papers the next day under a big type headline. It takes its first publication here. So there's a few anecdotes, a few passages from James Fitzallen Ryder's memoir of his 50 years in photography, and a little bit about Garfield. And now perhaps you can better understand how his short Civil War career as a general inspired the qualities that were his leadership was not only in politics, but it was also in the field of military operations, as remembered by the soldiers who respected him and the delegation of Black men who came to visit. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.